I share your anxiety, but not maybe your pessimism. Um,
That's a pretty common response. Welcome, everybody, to Road Work Ahead, a podcast that explores the unmapped future of business and technology. My name is Sam Gert, and today's interview is oh so very good. Is AI creative? It's not a simple question to answer. Creativity is a complex concept, and we have to dig into the many ways that word could be defined. Who better to ask about creativity than someone who's both an accomplished artist himself and an instructor at one of the most distinguished art schools in the country? Matt Saunders is a professor of art, film, and visual studies at Harvard University. His art has been featured in exhibitions around the world, and the list of museums with his work in their collections includes the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and many other names that you would likely recognize. Matt's art is grounded in the material, particularly painting. But in most of his work, you can see how he challenges himself to push back against the idea of a static rectangle of paint on canvas and create something more dynamic and transient, something more like an experience than an image. That same resistance to conventionality comes out in our conversation about AI, and it leads us to some brutally honest conclusions about how we view the techno-obsessed world around us. Matt is a very thoughtful and inspiring person, and this interview is easily one of the more impactful conversations I've had in a long time. Matt, thank you for joining me. I really only have one question, and I'm sure we'll get into it after that. But my question is, artificial intelligence, is it creative?
well, I don't even know how to answer that question until I think I need to understand what you mean by creative. Because I would say yes, but I feel like maybe there's a valence on creativity that is very perhaps ennobled in the way that people think about it in relationship to art, which is maybe not how I'm answering yes.
That's probably true. So let's go back to the beginning and let's ask a more basic question. What is your definition of creativity?
Hmm. I mean, to be honest, it's not a word I think about or use very much, but I think that I would define it as putting things together in ways that uh, make leaps, whether that's a leap out of a rational path, or whether it's a leap out of a series of expectations, whether it's an inversion of the status quo. Like the difference between an act and a creative act for me might be one that just hops over some kind of fence.
Yeah, you said you don't use the word creativity or you don't think about it a whole lot. As an artist, is there a reason for that, or is there another idea that comes into play far more often than the idea of creativity?
I think I'm a little allergic to the kind of mythologies that we build around artists as a different type of creature, a different type of activity. I feel like there's a continuity between making breakfast and making what turns out to be a milestone painting in someone's life. There's an activity of focus, of thinking, of reacting to past experience, of working with materials that is part of creating. And sometimes I think those creations are surprising. Sometimes that surprise lingers. Sometimes it's just something that, surprises you at first and you get over. And often things come back to stay with you or to challenge you or to make you think differently in the future. But in my experience, and maybe this is just the type of artist I am, I don't have a great amount of faith or predictive capacity in the act of making. I don't always know when I'm being creative, and I feel very strongly that there's a difference between the act of making something, the sort of generative act of putting things together, and then the moment of interpreting it or seeing it or understanding it, which is always based in time and place and changes over your life. When I say that I think AI is creative, yeah, it makes things. It's creative. It's creating things. Now, whether that is a virtue, whether creativity with a capital C is some special category that gives you special status, I don't know that I even would give that as a blanket to myself or to other people. I think it's something that you're touched by from time to time.
Well, can I ask the question? You're an artist. You're an accomplished artist. Why are you an artist?
I like I like things. I like making things. I like thinking about images. I'm a visual person and not so much of a musical person, or even a word-based person. And so it's a way to, for me, it's a way to work with my hands and my mind in a different way than I'm called upon to do in other types of professions. And I think I get great pleasure out of that time thinking in other ways. And I just love art. There's always, I think, something I feel kinship with my imagination of the sentience of an AI who's been trained on data sets is there's always an aspect of emulation. There's an aspect of being inspired by things that you've seen other people do, things you've seen in the museum, and that kind of itchy impulse you get to rush back to the studio afterwards. I was reflecting on that when I was trying to think about AI before this conversation, that I guess I do have my own data sets. I've been trained too.
I think for me, this is a question that I've been wrestling with for a long time. And that is, what about the fact that we are essentially computers with our own data sets? Why am I so quick to say that I can be creative, but that an AI can't? And I think what it comes down to is capacities, and whether or not an AI can ever have the capacity that a human can for synthesis. And I came across a quote by a Dr. Blumenthal who I think sums it up very well. He says, "There are no psychological qualities in physics. For example, there is no red, no green, or blue in the physical world. Redness, greenness, and blueness are phenomena that are created by the cortex of the experiencing individual. A musical quality, the flavor of the wine or the familiarity of a face, is a rapid creative synthesis that cannot, in principle, be explained as a mere sum of elemental physical features." And so, considering that quote, I have to conclude that a computer, which can only ever experience the elemental physical features of the world, will never be capable of this creative synthesis that's being described. In my own thinking on this topic, and this is something that I think from the beginning has rubbed me the wrong way in the way that we are being conditioned to talk about things like artificial intelligence. There were a lot of terms that started being used a lot more. So in the general, public conversation, we started hearing more and more about creativity. We started hearing more and more about generative AI, and we started being, I feel we started being conditioned to believe that artificial intelligence was or would become something threatening to human creativity. And I immediately didn't like that. I didn't think it was accurate, and I didn't think that it was healthy for us to even engage in that kind of thinking. And so from the beginning, I've been trying to figure out why that is. I have this gut reaction to it, but why do I have that gut reaction to it? And I started my career, I went to art school, I studied graphic design. So I have a little bit of a background in art, not quite fine art, but I've participated in the art world for a significant period of my life. Mm-hmm. And what I see is a big difference between something that is creative and something that is generative. I feel like creative is a descriptor of content that, like what you're saying, there's a leap there. It represents mm-hmm. a progress that was maybe unexpected, mm-hmm. maybe much needed, but undiscovered. But there's something new in it. There's something novel in it. And I also feel like creativity has to be rare. I feel like there has to be a rarity to it, because how can you call something that's common creative? How can you call something that it lacks that
Hmm.
novelty, that leap that I think is needed?
Hmm.
And with AI, I think what we're seeing that's difficult is we're seeing a blurring of the lines between the artist and the tool.
Hmm.
And we're also seeing this blurring of the lines because of how fast things are going. We're seeing AI generated content that is truly beautiful and technical. And it has all of the characteristics that we're accustomed to seeing in something that really truly is creative. But the problem is that we haven't yet caught up to the fact that because AI can do it now it's common.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
when Midjourney first came out, and we saw the images from this, Stable Diffusion is another example.
Hmm.
Um, the images that it was generating were striking. They were beautiful, and they were very stylistic, and they looked like they looked like art. And you could argue about the goodness or the badness of that art, but they looked very artistic. I saw that, and I would say it looks creative, but it's not. And I would say in a year's time, when 30 million people are subscribed to this tool, and they each are generating 10 images a day,
Hmm.
and you have 100 million, 200 million of these same kinds of images flooding into the internet every day, I have a feeling you're going to look at it and you're going to feel very differently about it than you do right now, seeing one or two of them here and there, because that commonality is going to make it feel uncreative to you.
I think I'm with you with what you've said, but there's a gap that opens up that I was thinking about when the creativity happens and whether creativity is a singular act. We think about AI generating something quickly, and we ask, was that creative? I feel very strongly that all art, all aesthetics, all value is distributed value. It's a art is a language, and it only is good if it means something, and it has the capacity to last. So the magic of art is that things can last for generations, and work can be meaningless for decades, centuries, and then suddenly mean a lot to a lot of people. And so maybe that's why I struggle with the word creativity, because it seems to arrive and just be. And I actually don't think that work's power exists in the world in that way. I mean, it might be very powerful in its moment of creation through its novelty. That's a word that you used a lot that I kind of chafe at as the as the ultimate value. But I have a much longer view of things. So I think what really makes sense to me in what you're saying is the idea of flooding the market. Something I really like about AI and the AI images we're seeing is that it puts pressure, I think, on our assumptions about value in art. Words like beauty, words like artistic, I might define differently from a lot of people. And that's not that I'm right or people are wrong. We live in different contexts and we look at different things. But I think that there's a kind of unreflected assumption of some values, like the value of what we think of as beautiful. If the world is full of a certain type of soft focused, light infused, I don't know, I'm trying to imagine what an AI beautiful image would be, luminosity, then will that continue to be beautiful? I think you're asking that question, and I agree with that, because I do think that one of the things that AI is doing now for me is generating a lot of images that I think are pretty drecky. I think that they are a little bit received ideas of what art might look like. I find most of them completely uninteresting, but I also see their appeal, and I'm wrong to think they're uninteresting because so many people think that they're interesting. But I sort of appreciate that they're so easy, and that's going to it's not going to replace artists, but artists are going to react to how the visual world has been changed by this type of image, and the
Yeah.
access and sort of ability for people to create, for the AI to create all these images, and that the creative responses will actually be the rejections of it, or the people who find ways to actively step to the left of it and offer some kind of alternative. And it's not an alternative will only be good in the moment when the baseline is the flood of AI images, and then it'll evolve.
There was the article that you responded to, the question that you responded to in an article several months ago about this very question. Is AI art really art? And one of the comments that you made in that article that I appreciated was that artists will be the one to help us imagine the new world that AI is helping us to create. The article I'm referencing here was published by the Harvard Gazette in August of 2023. It's called "Is Art Generated by Artificial Intelligence Real Art?" And here's exactly what Matt said in the article. To the question of whether AI can be a threat or a collaborator, I might respond that every new technology upends conventions and delivers not only new possibilities, but a new kind of material intelligence. I'm sure that many artists will be intrigued by the agency of AI and seek ways to grapple or collaborate with it. Many already are, and we should be grateful to be challenged and knocked out of our habits and assumptions. Most of the things that worry me about this fall into the realm of the social and ethical. I hope there are great artists to help us imagine around and work with this new reality. I think what you were saying is that the masses are going to use AI for a particular means, and they're going to move the world in a particular direction. And those who are on the outskirts of that crowd, those who are more imaginative, those who are more creative, are going to help to pull that mass of people in a particular direction, or help us to understand it in new ways. Because in some sense, the vast majority of people are just following the crowd, and there are those on the outskirts who look around and say, you know, they're seeing further, and they're looking in places that others aren't, and they're helping that crowd to imagine, to see what they see. I really appreciated that, but I think I appreciated it because it reinforced my own feelings, and that is that it's those people who stand on the outskirts of the masses who are looking elsewhere. Those are the people who are expressing themselves creatively, teaching others, creatively informing all of our imaginations and all of our thinking. And those end up also, I think, being the ones in other areas of life that are the innovators, that are the problem solvers, who end up taking us places we never thought we would go. If we do arrive at a place where artificial intelligence truly isn't an entity among us, something of a peer, it will be because of those people, those innovators who did truly creative work. It will be the result of that.
I mean, the categories we're talking in are just too big to get that much traction, because I think, you know, the role of an artist who I would admire, the kind of artist that I'm interested in my very narrow set of interests, does many things. And one is making images or ideas or objects that participate in a current conversation. I'm not that taken with the myth of the undiscovered genius in the attic, that I think that there is a current conversation in the art world, and there's a million art worlds, and that you are making things that are part of that. But of course, the people who I'm really excited about, and the people who in retrospect seem like the most important in the generations, are the people who bring a particularly critical or transformative or a different perspective to things. And I think that, you know, that tends to have an aspect of criticism. So the artists who are working with AI right now, who I'm most interested in, are the ones who are kind of pushing its limits. People who aren't even known yet. I have a former assistant who's trying to force the AI to break its own rules. You know, who's constantly working with the prompt and treating it as a kind of dialogue. So instead of focusing on the image or what could be created, he's focusing on the challenging creative activity of interacting with another maker and pushing boundaries, kind of trying to force the AI to fight with him. And to me, that's a kind of a creative approach to using the AI in line with conceptual art, and kind of like generations of artists who've thought about art's relationship to more popular culture, say not to reject it, but to find ways to cut under it, or to lay things bare, or to add friction, add turbulence to what could be a very smooth kind of marketplace.
Does that necessarily lead you to the conclusion that AI itself could never be an artist?
I'm not smart enough to know that because I assume that AI can internalize those strategies. The AI we're seeing now, I don't think is being fed David Hammonds or other artists who've really worked against the grain, and people are using it to make images.
Well, that's what I'm not entirely clear about is from a technical standpoint, AI can't respond with anything that it hasn't been trained on. That is, its responses are necessarily a diffusion of the data that it already has. And if the data that it already has is limited to what has already been made by people, then can AI add anything to the conversation? They've done experiments with this where the question is, well, can AI generate its own training data? Because that right now is the commodity that's in short supply, is training data. So the question is, well, if you could take an LLM and from the training data that it already has, if it could generate new training data, maybe we could train a smarter LLM, and the end result is it devolves into nothingness. So when we use AI-generated content as training data for future AIs, we call this content synthetic data. So synthetic data is not generated by people, it is generated by AI. The usefulness of synthetic data is going to vary from case to case and model to model. So, for example, it makes a lot of sense to use synthetic data for training a self-driving AI, and we see a lot of support for this kind of synthetic data being used in this use case. But when it comes to generative models, like the ones we're talking about here, LLMs and diffusion models that are being used to create written and visual content, the use of synthetic data to further train these models does have a degenerative effect. A July 2023 study entitled "Self-Consuming Generative Models Go Mad" went into great detail about this phenomenon. In the paper, the authors said, "Our primary conclusion across all scenarios is that without enough fresh, real data in each generation of an autophagous loop, future generative models are doomed to have their quality or diversity progressively decrease." Now, this is just one example, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the generative models we have today are not capable of synthesizing data in a way that could be considered additive. So that's where I'm wondering, can an AI be an artist if it's incapable of contributing something novel to the conversation, if it's incapable of developing the conversation?
My understanding of the diffusion is that it's partially about adding static, and I think anytime you make a space for the counterproductive, the irrational, the random, and then you hold that together with the form that you were given and judge whether it's working. I think that's kind of what an artist does. I feel like that is generative in a way that transcends its data set, or could be. Maybe it hasn't gotten there yet. Of course, I also am teaching, and when you're describing AI not being able to invent its own training set, I see people learn as artists in the classroom as very much, they have impulses, they have prompts for themselves, but things are always returning to what they think they know how to do, what they think art looks like, artists who they're trying to emulate. It's maybe not that far afield. It may just be kind of infant right now. The thing that, the MoMA piece, the Anadol, the installation that was in the lobby of MoMA for many months, that was rethinking the collection. I watched it a number of times, and I was very interested in what was happening. But to some extent, what was profoundly boring to me about it was the format, that it was given this screen, which is the same screen that's used for other art installations in that space. It was given a kind of generic sound setup. I feel like the sound that became attached with the images felt like middle of the road video art sound to me. A lot of what I didn't like about the piece was that it was in a box that was predetermined to make it look like art, and it made it look like video art. And so I had no sense of how creative the AI inside was able to be, because it was kind of confined as a screensaver.
Hmm.
And I don't know if there's something to unpack in that, but I do feel like the ability for the intelligence to generate or express things outside. I don't know how you get outside the box that the AI is in.
Yeah.
How things come into the world, because right now things do feel very, very confined by a lot of conventions of screen space, of you know even just how pixels are coded. There's
Yeah.
And so that's kind of an open question to me. If I think about like AI as a conceptual artist, and here, I guess here we get into the rise of the machines and things which do make me nervous. But um, that's I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on and on now, but there was a generational clash when I was in graduate school in the early 2000s around the computer and people who were using the computer as a digital tool. And one professor in particular, but a number of the faculty members had this critique that was, you can't use Photoshop because the tools in Photoshop were programmed by somebody else. And so you know, don't have the same agency over them. There was some idea that working within a format, you couldn't be creative because that format was already limiting you. And then, of course, it didn't account for the way that our generation was so native in Photoshop that people immediately found ways to work with it.
Hmm.
And I think I arrived at that through like thinking about the AI's functional limitations. But that's kind of what I'm optimistic about AI, is I think that it's just going to be part of the bigger idiom. Is going to be part of our visual culture, and artists always respond to visual culture, but it's also going to be a tool that it'll be a tool that people are used to interacting with, and will find ways to have ideas of their own in relation to it.
Do you feel like the format, the medium, do you feel that it matters at all? Or do you take a stance? You're a teacher. Do you take a stance with your students about the mediums that they choose to engage with or not? Obviously, you're paying attention to their expressions. You're paying attention to what it is that they're trying to communicate. And as students, they're exploring, and they're not necessarily dead set on one particular direction. How do you inform that direction?
You 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 think of all the things you could say to provoke somebody, and all the things you could offer them as potential other tools, and kind of follow your gut about what will be most generative. Sometimes people feel like they really have their grip on a certain way of working, and you want to encourage them to develop those skills or to build on those strengths to explore other ideas. And sometimes you feel like someone's ideas are being confined by their default assumptions about how they're going to generate them, and you try to give them a different tool to work with.
Yeah, see, I think that's a great example of what I see lacking in any kind of artificial intelligence for quite a while to come, and possibly even forever, it not being possible at all.
Well, people sometimes ask me how do you teach art? And I actually think that I don't know exactly how you teach art, but I know that the model of art education is a dialogic model. It's one of you making your work, but then being confronted with other opinions and other suggestions, and it's always a kind of crowdsourcing. And certainly when people leave art school, that's the big challenge, is how to generate all that for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I always feel like what I'm doing in the classroom is modeling all the ways that one can turn over a problem, and all the ways that one doubles down on something, and all the techniques that I've sort of learned to keep myself moving and to generate ideas in the studio. Not that the people I'm talking to will do the same thing, but hopefully that they can have my voice in their head, and they can
Yeah.
build that for themselves.
I'm just not sure how AI challenges itself.
Right.
I'm not sure how it stretches itself and tries to force that model breaking behavior independently. I see artists and I see technologists and even just normal people who are playing with the technology. I see them doing that and coming up with really interesting use cases and different results. But I see the vast majority of people just using it as it's presented to them in the ways that are suggested to them. And then what happens is the fork in the road, the divide gets wider. So those who are challenging it and really, really pushing it are the ones who are generating truly unique, novel, creative outputs. And the ones who are just using it are the ones who are contributing to that mass of unimpressive, hotel art, Thomas Kincaid type art. I think this same idea applies to all uses of AI. People who simply use the systems that they're given, they won't be standouts in the areas of productivity or effectiveness. The people who create new systems or subvert systems, those will be the ones who excel. So as we look in recent history, I think the creation of the internet is a good analogous example. The internet is an incredibly powerful tool, and it has done amazing things to change the world. But the way that it affects individuals is the same across the board. I'm no different than you in the fact that we have the internet and it helps us to be productive and effective. But if you compare me to someone who, say, knows how to subvert the internet, knows how to hack, knows how to program, knows how to build new things, new architectures, new infrastructures, that person has a significant advantage over me. You can go even further back in history and see examples of this as well. In the 17th century, a few mathematicians were experimenting with square roots of negative numbers. They were breaking all the rules of math, and most intelligent people thought they were nuts. René Descartes was the one who coined the term imaginary numbers, and he totally meant it as a slam. Fast forward to now, and the world as we know it couldn't exist without imaginary numbers. Most applied mathematics that we use in electrical and civil engineering only works with imaginary numbers. So the computer that you're working on right now, or the car that you're driving in, this technology that we're using right now could not exist if those rule-breaking mathematicians had not dared to experiment with something that most people thought couldn't or shouldn't exist. Before that, Leonardo da Vinci first theorized and then proved how the circulatory system worked. The popular belief of the day was that the liver made the blood and pushed it out to the periphery, where it was absorbed by the various tissues of the body. To discover the truth, da Vinci performed dozens of human dissections, many of which were illegal. He performed surgeries and experiments on live pigs in order to see the blood flowing in the body. He studied the fluid dynamics of water in rivers. He constructed his own artificial hearts out of glass or wax. Da Vinci's drawings and discoveries were a full 450 years ahead of their time. So the question that I keep asking myself is, if AI gives us a system within which to operate, and that system has rules, what is the means by which we improve upon that system? In all of human history, it seems the means of improvement was to break the rules. And is an AI equipped to do that? I think what I feel, especially everything that you've said, talking about how, you have this gut instinct and you have to, constantly be challenging, and all of these, there's all of these little pieces of what you're saying. And I'm like, yeah, I don't see how an AI can ever break out of the math of what it is and make those leaps.
Hmm.
But maybe time will tell. There just doesn't seem yet to be a mechanism. That part still seems to be science fiction.
I'm just nodding because you've thought about this a lot more than I have, and I buy that. I will. That sounds right to me if that's where we are. I'm just not sure.
I don't know for sure. See, like a lot of what happens is so far behind closed doors. All I see is what the world has, like what we're given, and I see what millions of people are doing with it generally, and then I hear people like you who have decades of experience creating and teaching others to create and to participate in these thoughtful conversations through various means, including art and all of the mediums within art. And I don't see any of that happening when people take the tool that they're given and just apply it. It's the ones who are like, I'm going to take this and I'm going to break it, who are actually like finding anything creative inside of it. But it's them. It's the act of breaking it. It's the means by which they break it. It's the choice to break it. And then to iterate on that process over and over and over again, that seems to be generating any amount of real innovation or value, whether it's artistic or technological.
There, I'll agree with you. I mean, personally. I have not seen any AI generated images that that I remember.
Yeah.
but I get, and it's crazy that I'm now advocating for AI in some sense. I don't want to predict that that's not going to develop. I mean, I know before the current model, there was more of an adversarial model. There was the idea of having two different programs, one generating and one judging. And, I think that there's certainly ways that this can get more and more complicated. Those creators who start to work with AI, maybe AI as a solo entity doesn't become creative for a long time, but as a half of a kind of partnership, I could see it really being a productive tool. I do, when you were talking, I was thinking too, the artists who have centered AI as a topic in the kind of art world that I'm tuned into, who I found most exciting and provocative, have not been working with the tools that we're talking about. I think that this shift in the last couple of years towards Midjourney or DALL-E has created a certain type of beast that's based on making pictures quickly.
Yeah.
Isn't exactly where it doesn't cover all of AI. So I'm thinking of people like Ian Chang or Pierre Huyghe, both of whom have thought more about the idea of sentience and life and kind of making artworks that question whether something is alive or whether life can be contained within the space of a video. In Ian's work, or Pierre has a big piece in Kistefos in Norway that is a forest that was scanned and then built as a digital environment with an AI god that's mutating and creating variants. And so there's this overlay of this kind of pristine wilderness and then this mirror of it that exists guided by a different intelligence. And he's like running these things and seeing how they start to, he's taking things that have been generated in the AI and actually making them in real life and putting them into the forest. And it becomes this kind of a multiverse idea. But those to me are not, well, they're not uninteresting. I think both those pieces have made me think a lot about our future with potential of living minds and machines, much more than any of the picture-based stuff has been.
You talked about two AIs challenging one another. One of the things that they do in training AIs like Midjourney or DALL-E or some of the more common ones is they'll use human feedback to inform the rightness, the correctness of the response to the prompt. So that kind of human feedback it turned out to be incredibly important in the training process in order to get the results that we get. And you still see this today. You can actually provide your own feedback in all of these tools, whether it's an image generation tool or a text generation tool like ChatGPT. And that feedback is invaluable in improving the product. The issue there that might be worth talking about is that you have so many people providing that feedback. The baseline is quite standard. It's not deviating. And so when you have artists who are in some sense challenging themselves or challenging other artists, I feel like there's this distancing from the norm. And I feel like with the kind of human feedback that we provide to an AI, all it's doing is consolidating into almost a singularity of the normal. I actually kind of think that that's more of, from an intellectual standpoint, that's probably more of an existential threat than even like, whether or not they can, cause a nuclear winter. Is this idea that our human knowledge is going to be reduced. It's not going to be varied and diverse. It's going to be standardized, globalized.
Is it not already?
I
really
think it's more so than maybe 100 years ago. I mean, technology, the internet certainly has connected us in ways that nobody ever imagined. And so, yeah, human knowledge and experience is definitely more globalized and more standardized now than it was. And there are good aspects of that, and there are bad aspects of that. Yeah. But what happens if you go to the extreme with it and there's only one answer? It's not that it's right or wrong, or that it's just that we've trained and we've trained and we've trained, and now there's no more room for any more feedback, and there's, in some sense, you would have to you start from scratch, train something new, but by that point you've conditioned the people, and so the people are thinking less differently than they were 100 years ago, and so now when the people train the new thing, they'll be less capable of training a diverse thing.
It's very dystopian. I think I have a better, a more confident view of human nature in some regards. I'd say not in regards to peace. But I have a lot of filmmaking friends. I mean, also because I teach in a department that has filmmaking. And of course, that's constantly been the conversation about the Hollywood models and what's allowed and how things get made. And it's a question of marketplaces. It's a question of economies as well. I think there's always going to be a lot of people who want to do the opposite. And so it's more a question of, to me, it's not a question of whether that creativity will emerge or exist in human imagination. It's like, are we going to have a society where it can be made? So I don't know. I spoke earlier about, I said it puts pressure on language. That's my strongest reaction a lot of times looking to AI. I mean, even some of the articles you sent over for me to read, there's one where it's asked to make a Renaissance painting. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at this image and thinking, there's zero in this image that has to do with a painting. That this is it's an idea of painting that's completely traveled through a cultural flattening into a style that is recognizable to the computer's painting. And it's that word is totally undone. And even the Munch, there was Kermit the Frog as Munch. It has zero relationship, I would say, to the things that were made by the historical person Edvard Munch, but has 100% relationship to the poster of the Scream. And so it really, my experience of AI is both complete irritation combined with a kind of provocation, a kind of sense of how ideas and language and styles, how visual ideas move into very broad understanding and get kind of misrepresented or get transformed. And so it forces me to grapple with thinking about what is Munch from my perspective, having just gone to look at a ton of his work in the last couple of weeks, or what is a painting. And I bristle, of course. I think, oh, you idiots, that's not a painting at all. Like, that is the flattest idea you can imagine it. But then it's up to me to respond to that. We're going to live in this world. And if it forces me to be outraged and feel like people are misunderstanding, maybe that pivots my work to engaging with those feelings more versus just assuming that we're all communicating. And that's for me, the silver lining is that it, like things that have happened in all kinds of pop culture, I think it has flattened, but it also creates a space for a different type of weirdness on top of the form. It just becomes a different point of reference or kind of touchstone. Does it piss me off when people are sharing AI images that I think are absolutely banal and saying how amazing they are? Do I think, don't be an idiot, come to the museum with me? Yes, of course I think that. But I don't know what else we can do. It's how culture has always kind of moved.
You're highlighting the exact same feelings that I have in different areas. You're highlighting how you look at an AI generated image and there's an immediate recognition of what it is. Right. And you're highlighting the fact that in that recognition, you've already made a decision about it and you're already moving on. And there's a sense in which a person can make themselves even less distinct than if they did nothing by generating the AI image. It's like you've just classified yourself in some sense in my mind because I recognize immediately what you've done. There's nothing creative about it. It falls into the exact same category as every other AI generated image I've ever seen. And then I'm so quickly moving on. I'm ready to move to the next thing. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's exactly what you just said, but I have felt that way, certainly. And going back to what I said earlier, that and you used words that I think better describe how I was feeling, cultural flattening. This idea of removing the diversity and variation that exists within cultures and giving us all just a baseline understanding of the rightness or wrongness of something, the goodness or badness of something. If we look at life 100 years ago versus life now, I feel like the disconnected nature of humanity, the localization of it, resulted in wildly distinct opinions, worldviews, art, all kinds of distinction. And the more that you expose yourself to all of the rest of the world and everyone else participates in that as well, that distinction starts to flatten, it starts to diminish. So I guess you could phrase that as a question. What are some of the differences that you see between an artist who is a more modern artist who is exposing himself to all of the world, all of culture, who's absorbing all of that, versus maybe an artist from centuries past who was very local? His experiences were very limited. Do you see those differences when you look at their work? Do you feel those differences, or do you interpret it all from your own perspective?
Of course, to see those differences, and of course, I interpret it. I feel like we can't undo the interconnected nature of the world, and I think that we're projecting maybe backwards a little bit of difference on things that feel from a very different time. You know, if you think about whatever, like Botticelli in Florence is living in a Catholic monoculture with narrow parameters, never left his, aside going to Rome once, he never left Florence. There's a flattening to that, perhaps. Now we see it in relationship to other things that are happening, so we don't see it as a flattening, but I share your anxiety, but not maybe your pessimism.
That's a pretty common response.
And yeah, I am someone who has a mixed relationship to kind of the biggest kinds of pop culture. I'm a little out of it, and I've worked in my own work kind of against it. I've tended to be more interested in unearthing stories and kind of digging into the archives and countercultures, but that's more who I am. That's not a claim that everyone should be like that. Growing up in the sort of late 20th century, the art history we were taught about painting was always about the crisis of photography. The idea that photography comes along, and this is, of course, a very flat description of this idea, but that photography replaces the representational function of painting, and that opens up a century of abstraction and innovation and crisis. It's more complicated than that, but if enough people are feeling a crisis of flattening out of AI, then there's a really interesting crisis that we can work with. I don't think that we're trapped to live in a world which is going to be full of these images. Yes, that's going to happen no matter what, but I don't think that as artists we're not able to push back against that if that starts to feel suffocating. I find myself thinking really quickly about a number of artists who emulate popular forms, like artists who try to become pop stars, or the large number of artists who get successful and then try to make a feature film. And there is this kind of artistic creative impulse to infiltrate or to act the culture. So I wonder if an artist acts as AI, what that space might be at some point. Like impersonating Dolly, hacking someone's system, and never mind. Cut that part of the interview.
I know Matt felt like he was derailing the conversation with this admittedly silly idea, but here I am in the edit a few weeks later, and I cannot help but Google this idea of humans impersonating AI. So without getting too sidetracked, here are two interesting examples that I found. Last summer, several creators on TikTok started trending for their NPC live streams. They would stand in front of the camera with their hands held awkwardly in front of them and sway back and forth like an AI video game character. Viewers could pay money to send virtual gifts to these streamers, and the streamers would react to the gifts in the same canned way that you'd expect from an AI avatar. It is absolutely bizarre. You can go on TikTok and find these people still doing this. But apparently it's wildly popular, and the whole thing reminds me of the living statue street performers in New York City. The second example I found is from 2018, and it's a startup strategy, and it's called pseudo AI. There were several cases reported where startup companies would present themselves to investors or customers as AI-powered companies. but the processes that were supposed to have been AI powered were actually offshore contractor powered. The idea was to reduce or delay the initial development costs of implementing AI powered services. So, by taking advantage of cheaper offshore labor, startups could more efficiently prototype their processes. Once they scaled, they could hand things over to the AI systems. What I found interesting about this example is the people that they interviewed for the articles that I found who were doing this work were expressing how much they hated it, how mundane it was, how much they could not wait for a bot to take their job. So, in answer to Matt's question of what would it look like, I kind of think imitating AI, imitating the computer, looks boring. It looks bland. It looks unappealing. And I think that says something about the conversation we're having here. The experience of being human seems to me to be far better than the experience of being a computer. When you look at the students coming in today, the art students coming in now, and you compare them to maybe when you were first starting as a student, what are some of the biggest generational differences that you see when answering the same questions? Like, what is creativity? What is art?
That's a really good question. And there are definite differences. There are differences about the assumption of what art does and where it lives. Certainly, I have one really great student in particular whose highest goal is to be on Instagram. And those are fundamentally different ideas about what you're actually producing and what's circulating. A sense of what role materiality plays in a work is quite different. I think the thing that I quote the most is something that a lot of artists quote. I'm not even sure if it's apocryphal, but it's always attributed to Ed Ruscha. And it's this idea that some work you look at and you say, wow, huh? But that he loves work that you say, huh? Wow. That made so much sense to me when I was told it, because I believe that work should be difficult and should open up and should be inscrutable and should be complicated to read. And I think that fundamental sense of values has shifted a bit. I think that the legibility, efficiency, speed of consumption, delivery of a message, what I would call the kind of more illustrative quality of work, which was a very pejorative term when I was in school, is now a positive for a lot of people. How quickly we consume these images, how quickly we read the thing and judge it.
I hadn't thought too much about this shift in favor of the illustrative until Matt mentioned it, but it's something that I also recognize. It's an evolution that makes sense when you consider how our world has changed over the past 30 years. We live in an attention economy, in a digital world now. The demand for things like graphic design and digital illustration has skyrocketed since the mid-90s, and that demand tugs on everything. The way we look at art is changing too. The pace at which we consume and demand new content is mind-numbing compared to previous decades. We look at art on 4-inch screens instead of a canvas. In having a conversation about creativity, it's hard to ignore the fact that our collective definition of the word itself and the standard by which we measure it has changed radically. And I would argue that it's not changing for the better, but for the worse.
And there are ideas that come up around the AI question around rightness, around function, around efficiency, that I think for someone of my generation raised some hackles in relation to creativity. I fundamentally don't think that art is problem solving. I feel like it's making propositions which may or may not mean anything to anyone. And if they mean something to someone, then they become a great proposition. But I don't feel like subconsciously on some level you of course are, but I'm generally don't feel like I'm judging my work in terms of does it do what it should do. It's more, what did it do, and is that something worth keeping? It's a hope that it arrives at some provocative, unexpected state. Maybe that's the jump over the fence that I started out by talking about as creativity, that if it's not what I expected it to be, and it seems better, then that's the work that I cherish and put out into the world. And that's kind of my approach to to making. But I think that I take very seriously that I don't, that doesn't seem like an immediately shared value.
As an artist yourself, your work tends to be a mixture of material and digital. Yeah, mixture of physical and digital. You definitely do a lot of experimenting with both. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, 100%. The digital is secondary and comes in almost in terms of the its flexibility in showing the work. Most of the digital things I do are digital videos, which are made out of real, the work is always made with real materials and then scanned. And I'm very conscious that between the scan and the experience of the installation or the projection in the gallery, there's a lot of things you can do in the digital space that's a kind of digital materiality. And I do play with that and experiment with that. But everything starts on the page. It starts with, in my case, a brush of some kind because I hate pencils. But yeah.
Again, it's will an artificial intelligence ever express anything like that? I mean, even just like I always start this way because I hate that. It's like, well, but wait a minute. What do you mean? You're gonna have to explain that to me. It's that diversity, I think, that makes it so appealing. Anything so appealing, and as soon as you remove that element, I'm in marketing now, and so like, what is marketing except to pull on an emotional string?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see how we are doing any better accomplishing that by being overly dependent on these tools when all that they do seems to be reductive. And maybe that's, like you said, I tend to be a pessimist with these things. Even you talk about the generational differences, your students, I've talked to other professors before, and they've said exactly the same thing. I have students whose goal, whose aspiration is to be on social media. I bristle at that because it seems to me to be foolish in so many ways. But the flip side of that is I'm also belonging to a generation who just doesn't get it in the same way, and that's why I asked about the generation that you're teaching now. It seems like they're living more of a digital life, and so the conversations that they're having are going to be digital, and the ways that they're thinking and the issues that are affecting them are going to be digital. I'm with you. I much prefer the material, but I also don't have any interest in living in that digital world, in that digital space.
There's such a diversity of spaces in which to live. Yes, it would seem horrendous to me to be big on social media, but I extend that also to the idea of genres and something that I always thought about visual art is that it's behind a lot of other types of art making. Like within music, we really understand the diversity of different types of music and what genres different things fit into. And it's absolutely commonplace to say, I like this and I don't like this. But we do seem to often have this kind of totalitarian impulse to define all of the art of a time. And I've never seen it that way. There's so much art that I respect, and I respect people's desire to want to do that, but I have absolutely no interest in making that kind of work. For me at the moment, AI is very much in that category, but the world changes and new genres come and new places to live come. And I am curious about next generations and what options they have and trying to understand it, which is maybe why I'm so open-minded to this right now.
You talked about the flatness of Botticelli living in Florence his whole life, hardly ever leaving except for the one time, and how that is a flat existence in its own way. And how the difference is, from our perspective, we see that existence with all of the, thousands and millions of other existences, and we can appreciate each of them for their diversity, looking at all of them together, and how now with a more global view, global mindset, there seems to be a global flattening in some sense. It seems like there's a whole lot of value in understanding where you live and where you belong and what your particular, as individuals, we can't live these incredibly diverse lives. We are going to have our own flatness to us as, beings living in a particular place at a particular time with particular beliefs and experiences. There's flatness in that, but understanding where you belong and then staying there and developing it and developing that conversation with other unique individuals while maintaining your integrity. That seems to be, to me, the goal of any artist today, to know who you are and what your purpose is and what your belief is, and then taking that and interfacing with other people who are doing the same thing. The threat from AI that I think I've talked about could be restated as the antithesis of that idea. People know less of who they are and where they belong. They know less of their individuality, their uniqueness, and they see themselves as being just one tiny piece of this big amorphous blob of people and culture and just a mishmash of everything.
Yeah.
So wow. It's such an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's so dark. It's so true. I mean, I'm
so dark.
I'm with you on that. I think it's
well, this is.
No, go on.
I was just going to say this has been one of the weirdest conversations about AI that I've ever had.
I feel like I leave with more questions than I came in with, and I keep coming back to the film idea that came up, and the sort of the history of that medium. Since it's relatively short, we can look at it and think about the way that studios consolidated the ability to make films, and you have an era that goes through all the studio codes, and then there's a moment when the tools change and indie cinema becomes accessible, and then that gets consolidated, and we're living in a moment of kind of consolidation around television and film, but also an opening up of all the tools, including AI, that can make movies. We haven't talked about this, but I've encountered film students at Harvard who are using AI to edit their clips and even generate things. And, I think there's some curiosity about that. But that's part of where I have hope about this, is I feel like right now, all our anxiety is up and all our eyes are focused on one or two big platforms. And so it seems very flattening, but I do, have to assume that things will come along that will change those dynamics and create radically different versions of AI creators, and maybe a kind of underground and an off cycle. And I could be totally wrong, but there's the basic question you started with about creativity. But for me, that immediately gets into questions of the marketplace and the tools of production, the means of production for that. And I think that we're at the real infancy of accessibility and use of AI. So hopefully it goes, and hopefully people mess with it in the right ways.
Yeah. Well, for my part, I put my money on the artists and the innovators and the technologists who are doing that breaking, who are doing that challenging, and who aren't who are resisting the urge to just join, and go with that flow of where these tools might take us, especially in their infancy. Because over and over and again, I feel like that gets validated in everything that I see. The ones who are actually adding value to the world are the ones who are trying to break AI, who are trying to recreate it into something different than what it is, not the ones who are using it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is an interesting discussion. I loved that. Matt, I thank you for talking to me. It was a real pleasure. You are an incredibly interesting person to talk to. I love your ideas, and maybe in time we reconnect and see
Sure.
how how we feel about what we've said, how we've changed, how we've been changed, and and at some point, I'm sure we're both going to have to engage with AI a little bit more, break down some of those walls that we have, those
Yeah.
resistances that exist, and I would love to see like what happens with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you very much. It was really it was surprising that you reached out, and I've really enjoyed the conversation.